We are live.
Thank you. I'd like to call the Affordable Housing Advisory Group a special meeting on Monday, July 25th to order. This is a reschedule of our regular meeting, which was to be held last Monday, but we had to reschedule due to a notice issue. I'd like to thank the committee members and Dr. Poland for their ability to reschedule on short notice. On our agenda this evening is only one business item. We'll get to that in a moment. The only thing to remind the committee about is our next regularly scheduled meeting is on Monday, August 15th. At the end of this meeting, we'll discuss potential additional subcommittee meetings, perhaps before then or within the month of August. And having said that, our first item under business items, agenda item number 5, is a presentation from Dr. Donald Poland of Gorman in York. And this is essentially a follow-on presentation to our last month meeting where Dr. Poland provided in understanding housing markets and affordable housing overview for the committee. It was very detail-oriented, rich, and well-received, I think, by all. And tonight is a follow-up presentation about West Hartford housing analysis and housing needs assessment with more specific analysis of West Hartford data. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Poland.
Great, thank you, Todd. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me back tonight. So I'm going to be talking about housing analysis, taking a deep dive look at the housing stock and various aspects of it within West Hartford. And then we'll wrap up with a housing needs assessment. This is a much shorter presentation than last time. So let me get started. So we're going to look at housing stock characteristics, cost characteristics, the needs assessment, and housing need versus demand. So 3 tables on the right-hand side here provide some breakdown about your existing housing stock. Total number of units, occupied units, owner versus renter occupied, household sizes, and then the breakdowns of the types of units, single family, detached, all the way through to multifamily and so forth. A few highlights on the left-hand side here, just to provide you context in the sense of vacancy rates. Typically, vacancy rates less than 8% indicate strong demand and may indicate the need for additional supply. When vacancy rates drop less than 5%, it's a very strong market, and typically vacancies are the result of naturally occurring turnover. That is, that there's not a lot of unoccupied housing in the marketplace. As you can see here, your vacancy rates are very low. On owner-occupied housing stock, it's 1.3, and on renter housing stock, it's 4.4. Which informs us that West Hartford is a very strong market. And I think we all already knew that, but the data confirms it. So housing size by tenure, the majority of your housing stock, 65% is single family detached, add in the single family attached, and 72.2% of your housing stock is in the single family category, which is the category most favorable to home ownership. Percentage of single unit detached almost mirror the occupied percentage of owner occupied housing stock. So the 70.2 and the 69.4. This is typically pretty common. We expect to see this since the single family housing stock is the most popular for owner occupancy. And then your average household size. You'll see there's actually kind of a substantial difference between the size of households in owner-occupied housing and renter-occupied housing, with more than half of a person more in the owner-occupied. Once again, this is fairly typical. We almost always see a larger number in the owner-occupied column and a smaller number in the renter-occupied. The spread here is probably a little bit bigger than we typically see, as you can see there with kind of the state and the county numbers, that they're a bit closer together. Once again, this indicates to me, ultimately data that we'll see later on kind of small renter occupied household sizes. And the remaining 29.2% of the housing stock is in various forms of missing middle and multifamily. For a suburban community, you actually have a fairly high percentage of 2-unit dwellings and 3 and 4-unit dwellings, and then also multifamily dwellings. So my general take is you have a diverse housing stock compared to most suburban communities. I recently did this analysis, I think in the town of Granby, and over 90% of their housing stock is in the single family category, with less than 10% covering kind of the missing middle and the multifamily housing stock. So there is diversity within your housing stock. Bedrooms, 63.5% of your housing stock has 3 or more bedrooms. Once again, not a surprising number. We expect it with single family, detached housing and attached housing. However, with decades of decline in household sizes and the number of households with children, I kind of always check this with kind of just a red flag, a little bit of caution that maybe we need to pay attention to this. I don't think it's a huge issue in West Hartford due to the diversity in your housing stock. In a community like, say, Granby that I just mentioned, where 90% of the housing stock is single family, where 70% of the housing stock is 3 bedrooms or more, I then become concerned because of that lack of diversity in the stock overall. But it may point to a housing stock that's designed more for past generations and may not serve all of today's households as well. And I'll talk more about that as we get to some later data. Housing age, your housing is much older than the county and the state, and only 20% of your housing was built between 1970 and 2020. So in the past 70 years have only accounted for 20% of your housing stock. 80% is more than 50 years old. Once again, in West Hartford, I'm not usually concerned with that because of the robustness and vibrancy of the community, because of the wealth within the community. I know your housing stock's being invested in regularly, whereas in some communities, if they weren't as wealthy, weren't as vibrant, an older housing stock can point to often a deteriorating housing stock. And I'm not convinced that's a issue here. So this is a study issued on a yearly basis by the National Association of Realtors. It's the most recent years, the 2021 Home Buyers and Sellers Generational Trends Report. And it looks at what's going on in the home buying market by generation. And I think there's some interesting information here for West Hartford. So most common type of home purchase is still the single family home, detached single family home at 81% of all purchases. This makes sense. Nothing new here, but it is interesting that buyers between the age of 22 and 30 purchase townhomes at a higher share than any other age group. And that's kind of pointing to generationally, younger generations maybe seeking out a little bit different housing stock than previous generations. And millennials are more likely to purchase in urban areas, and the convenience to jobs and commuting costs were both most important to this group. Once again, I think that's important to note. And there's only a median of 15 miles from homes. There was only a median of 15 miles from the homes that recent buyers purchased, previously resided in, to the homes they purchased. My point here on this one, I think what's most significant is we actually don't move long distances typically. Yes, people make long moves for jobs. Yes, we'll see that the older populations here in the second line move further. That's probably for grandchildren, but in general, our moves are short. And I think that's important to understanding the overall market, and that renters are actually probably your best opportunity as future home buyers. Once people are settled and established in a community, the likelihood of them moving a long distance away is limited. So the typical recent home purchase was 1,900 square feet, has 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and was built in 1993. The size of homes for buyers 41 to 55 was a little bit larger at 2,100 square feet. For buyers 22 to 30, it was smaller at 1,650. Once again, we could be seeing a generational difference. It could also be the capacity, the income capacity of the buyers at certain ages, only being able to afford so many square feet of house. And buyers 75 and older were in between at 1850. And interestingly enough, buyers of 66 to 74 typically purchased the newest homes, with the median homes being built in 2000. That is probably a kind of a commentary on open floor plans, one floor living, maybe wider doorways, ADA compliance, and so forth, that a newer housing stock becomes more appealing to an older and aging population. And for buyers 22 to 29 years old, commuting costs were very important at 44%, whereas with older purchasers, windows, doors, and siding were also very important, not wanting to spend money in retirement on a fixed income. All in all, my feeling is this report, kind of the typical or average home buyer, bodes well for West Hartford. I think your housing stock fits well into this data, and I think it's a fairly favorable circumstance, especially the location, especially the short commute times with a younger home buyer. I always like to provide this historical context because, in many ways, communities, especially in the planning and zoning permitting world, we always think that there's extensive development pressure and that everything's being developed and so forth. And historically, the fact is, Connecticut used to build a lot of housing. There was a point in time when I would put us into a strong or high growth state. So prior to 1990, we were a moderate to high growth state with substantial new housing construction. And you can see that here in this graph, where we were averaging through the 60s, 70s, and then even for a period of time in the 80s, we were averaging statewide over 20,000 permits per year for new housing. However, since 1990, Connecticut's become a stagnant to slow growth state with anemic housing construction, reflecting stagnant job growth and anemic population growth, both weak demand drivers, which I spoke about last time. You see here, after the crash of the market in 1989 and then the 90s, we dip. We stop building a lot of housing. We drop into kind of the 10,000 units, below 10,000 units per year. And then we start averaging in the early 2000s around 10,000 units per year. At least for me, being in planning over this period of time, and probably for you being involved in your community, we've had this feeling that there was a tremendous housing boom in the early 2000s. But comparatively, it was actually only about half of what we used to do. And then you see 2008 hits and the market crashes again and we level off. For me, from a data standpoint, the fact that there's crashes and then we level and then we crash again and then we level at a new norm, we go from 10,000 down to 5,000, isn't a positive sign long term. And the fact is, we're not building a lot of housing anymore. And that's because we don't have the job growth and we don't have the population growth. This comes back into play when we talk about affordable housing and need versus demand. So prior to 1990, a meaningful portion of Connecticut's housing stock was multifamily. Look at this up here in the green. That's the multifamily, 5 or more units. We used to build a lot of multifamily housing. We also, if you look at the oranges, we had a fair portion of that missing middle of the 2 and 3 and 4 unit housing. When you come past 1990, the share of multifamily contracts down to what, 10% at best, and the missing middle almost goes away. But if you see here at 2012-ish or so, the multifamily starts becoming a much larger percentage of the total. And I think this is reflecting our shift in demographics. That today, approximately 47% of new housing construction in Connecticut is multifamily. In the context of West Hartford, I think, and I said this in the report, I think in more detail, you're pretty much built out from a land perspective. The only way to kind of add new housing now is through redevelopment, the demolition and redevelopment of sites. And I think you've seen that, whether it be from over a decade ago at the corner of Walbridge and Farmington Ave, where I think 2 houses went away and 16 condos went up in their place, or the redevelopment of the area that's occupied by Blueback Square today and so forth. That future for you, the future of housing development is going to be more in the multifamily stock than it is going to be in the single family stock. So housing stock cost considerations. To afford a median owner-occupied home in West Hartford at $330,000, you need approximately $110,000 income. So very rough average numbers, but gives us some context. That income is 4,800 or approximately 5,000 higher than your median household income of 105,000. So this indicates that West Hartford's homeowner housing stock leans towards being less affordable. You're tipping to the less affordable side of the regional marketplace. And of the owner-occupied housing units in West Hartford, the 17,000, approximately 63% have a mortgage. That's probably a insignificant number. It's pretty typical for more properties to have mortgages than, not. When we look over here at the housing costs, median owner-occupied housing value of 330, the median cost of a house with a mortgage housing costs, which include things like taxes and utilities, is about $2,459 a month. And costs for homes without a mortgage are approximately $1,100 a month. What we're seeing really is the difference between the mortgage payment, including interest, and a house without the mortgage payment included there. Oh, just to note, both of these numbers are higher, substantially higher than the county, and also higher than the state itself, which once again on the regional level says West Hartford, especially on the home ownership side, is a more expensive place to live than the region as a whole. So this calculation of homeowner costs is used to measure housing affordability and excessive shelter costs, excessive costs that exceed 30% of household income. If we go back to my last presentation, this idea that if you're spending more than 30% of your income on housing, mortgage or rent, plus taxes, utilities, and so forth, then housing is becoming unaffordable. So 25.2% of your households with mortgages and 22.4% of households without mortgages are paying 30% or more of their household income on housing. It's a fairly high number. That says there's a, fairly substantial amount of households that are, paying a lot. Now, whether that is by choice, for various reasons, or whether it's simply due to economics, can't afford anything, or can't access anything less, is hard to tell. But I'll talk more about that later. So approximately 24% of owner-occupied households are unaffordable, but it doesn't inform us as to whether costs are the result of burden of income or personal choices. In the houses without the mortgages, my primary feeling is in this 22.4%, you're capturing a large portion of elderly, retired, fixed income households. And remember, I said this last time in the context of income, the census measures earned income, not wealth. And my gut tells me in a town like West Hartford, the earned income of the household is paying more than 30% to survive in their house without a mortgage. But a large portion of those households probably have a net wealth that's far greater than that. And if that were considered, that number would probably drop down. And once again, I'll come back to that. So median gross rent is $1,361, and I just want to point to you here, Hartford County is only $1,100, statewide is slightly less than $1,200. Your rental housing is running substantially, higher than the regions and the state. And 30% of rental households pay $1,500 or more per month. I use the $1,500 per month because that's approximately the 80% AMI value. So a fairly substantial portion paying on the higher rent scales. In addition, 41.7% of rental housings are spending 30% or more on their household income on rent. So think about that. The combined number on the ownership was 24%. And when we move into the rental housing market, now the affordability issue jumps to 41.7, almost 42% of renter households spending more than 30% of their income. 28.9% of total renter and owner-occupied households are paying above the affordability threshold for housing. And once again, that's a fairly high number, and it points to, an affordability challenge or issue in West Hartford. So income by household, while the median household income in West Hartford for all households is 105, your median family income is 137. Married couples family median income is 162, and non-family median income is 56.5. So for me, these are really important numbers to pay attention to. One is your median household income is high. It's above the region. We already said that in the last presentation. Median family income is even higher. That's a typical trend. We almost always see family income higher than household income. And then married couple income, in the case of West Hartford, is kind of off the chart. It's the dual professional household that's driving this number high. And it's much higher than we typically see. But where these numbers all become important is then when you move to the non-family income, and we plummet to 56,000. Now the fact is your 56,000 is higher than the regional average or the state average. It's still a decent value, but it's much lower than your median household, your your family and your married couple income. And that becomes important when we start thinking about who are the households occupying what kinds of housing stock. Your single family detached is most likely going to be families and married couples. And then when you move into the rental stock, that's where you're going to see more of your non-family. So we can maybe start seeing kind of the affordability challenge, maybe leaning more towards the rental side than the owner-occupied side. So family households account for 62% of all households. Non-family households account for 37%. And of the family households, 78.2 earn 75,000 or more, while 63% of the non-family households earn 75,000 or less. So once again, we see that kind of flip-flopping here. So the difference in family and non-family income is dramatic, but not surprising based on the number of one-person households. 32% of your occupied housing, 21% of your owner-occ, and 46.1% of your renter-occupied housing. So this is where I think affordability becomes very nuanced and very challenged. We built our housing kind of on past generations. I do this presentation with my students in some of my planning classes that tracks kind of demographic trends against sitcoms. And I show pictures of like from Leave It to Beaver through to the Brady Bunch to Family Ties. So then you hit the 1990s and it's Friends and Seinfeld and Sex and the City. The families go away. We built a housing stock, and especially West Hartford with an older housing stock built a housing stock to cater to and serve the needs of families that had lots of children previously. And today we're seeing, 28% of total households nationwide are single person. So we're seeing that on your rental occupied housing, 46% of your renters are single person households. That's in part a good reason why this number comes in so low. It's only one income, 46% of your rental housing, it's only one income to get there versus two in the family or in the married couple and so forth. So a big difference there. And that's kind of the mismatch between the housing stock and our demographic trends and housing costs and our demographic trends. So the housing needs assessment, I basically go through and I compare income to housing cost. This isn't a perfect model, but it's kind of the best we can do to try and identify where is their housing need. And ultimately what we see on the owner-occupied housing, greatest need for household incomes below 75,000, approximately 80% AMI. Greatest need for affordable home ownership is at below approximately 80% AMI. Ownership housing, 80% AMI would be about $225,000. That's over 100,000 less than your median sales value in West Hartford. So this may in part help explain why 25% of households with a mortgage and 22% without are paying 30% or more. And if we look at these cohorts here, what these final numbers say to us is that there are 586 fewer housing units at this income level than there are households. Same here, 484 fewer units. Fewer units, fewer units, fewer units. It's when you get up in here that the market's functioning well. There's more units, there's more income to support those units. When we get here, it just says you have a lot of really wealthy people that far exceed the housing cost, and it's not a problem. When we look at the rental side, greatest need for rental housing is at the lowest income levels, below 15,000, or what is essentially 19% AMI. This is well below the federal poverty rate, that's around 28,000. There's 636 fewer rental housing units available than the number of households, and these are your most at-risk populations. At incomes of 15,000, above 15,000 and below 30, so this is from 19 to 44% AMI, there are 460 fewer rental housing units available than the number of households. And at incomes of 35 to 50, essentially, there's more housing units than there are households. When I look at these two numbers here, this one being very large at 27 or 2,700, this one being very low at 82, my gut tells me this is kind of the same segment of the housing market, and it's just kind of how things are playing out. But people at these incomes and people at these incomes are probably competing for the same units. We then see a lot more wealth at the higher end of the rental spectrum, or the fact is there's not a lot of super high-end units that are challenging the wealth at the higher end. Household by size, type, and tenure. So this is important because impact affordable housing. The data may explain the earlier discussion with 25.2% and 22.4% of homeowners paying more than 30%. And the large number of, there's a large number of persons 65 and older, or 14.7% owner-occupied households that may be retirees and widows on fixed incomes. So we start seeing in here when we break these down and we look at kind of percent owner-occupied, and then we start looking at by age. The census table has much more detailed breakdown on age. I just focused in on the plus 65. But nearly 15% of your family households are plus 55 in age. When we go to non-family households, 12.7%. So right there we have what, 14 and 12, 27 to 28% of your owner-occupied housing stock is occupied by households 65 and older. That's where I start thinking that's what's raising up this number of the 22% affordable, spending more than 30% without mortgages. Then when we go into the with mortgages and so forth. So we start breaking down these data points and try and make sense of what it may be telling us. So the 42.2% one-person renter households, or the 27.3% two-person renter households. This is up here. Put those numbers together and we're what, 56, 66, 75% of your renter housing stock is occupied by one and two persons. Very few, very low numbers. And that goes back to, remember, only 2.06 was the average household size for a renter household. So we're probably dealing with a lot of single income households in that renter housing stock, which is also probably predominantly non-family households and in this $56,000 range. So housing need versus demand. This is a continual struggle for me on how to present this, how to discuss this, and what's important. But we have this kind of 10% threshold that's been set by 8-30G. In some ways, I think of it as it was an attempt at kind of this fair share. Every community should have a portion of its housing be affordable. And I don't disagree with that. I'm just not sure that 10% is the right number or a realistic number. And when we apply it in West Hartford, based on your existing affordable units, based on your existing housing stock, in order to reach 10%, you would have to add 607 more qualified units. Now, mind you, the numerator and denominator are continually changing, so that 607 would change over time also. So if West Hartford were to require 10% of all new housing construction be affordable, you would have to build 6,070 units of housing in order to achieve 607 qualified units. If you were to say 20% affordable new construction, you still have to build 3,000 units to achieve 607. This becomes challenging, and I provided here on the right-hand side a table of your historic housing production, total units constructed per year here, and then the net gain after demolitions here on the right-hand side. And what we find is to achieve 607 units in 10 years, West Hartford would have to build 61 qualified affordable units each year. The historic 25-year absorption rate for all housing is 63 units per year. So how do we realistically, develop a strategy to add affordable housing to say achieve this 10% level when the rate or the demand for housing is equal to what the overall market rate demand is? So at the 25-year historic absorption rate, it would actually take you 96 years to add 6,070 housing units in West Hartford. So it's the soft to weak market demand for housing, that lack of job growth, that lack of population growth, that is the greatest barrier to affordable housing in Connecticut and West Hartford. And this has been something I've been saying around the state for years now. So in some ways, it's unreasonable to expect West Hartford can achieve the 8-30G imposed 10% affordable in a realistic amount of time. And that's why I don't think we collectively, or you as a community, should get too focused on the 10%, trying to achieve it. I think the key goal is, how do you move towards it? How do you make sure that you're continuously moving towards it and continuously trying to provide and add more affordable housing, recognizing that that is a betterment to the community. Otherwise, you're going to be constantly frustrated by the fact that we're not at 10% or we can't get to 10%, and so forth. So I'll stop on that note and provide opportunities for questions. And I think Todd may have had some that were emailed in.
Thanks, Dr. Poland. We did have a couple folks who were not able to attend, although I think some might have signed on since the start of the meeting. And I'll leave it for the people in attendance live. Tricia, happy to go through you. If anyone has questions for Dr. Poland based on the presentation provided or the more detailed presentation that was emailed out a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. So I see 2 hands up. First hand I can see is Greg Kirschner.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Dr. Poland. Very, very interesting. I was able to read the longer version. When you talk about housing absorption rate, you're talking about the rate that basically predominantly market rate housing has been absorbed in the community over the last 25 years, right?
Yes and no. So yeah, it's predominantly market rate, but it would include any affordable housing stock that was built in that period. So
right, but is it accurate that for affordable housing in West Hartford, there's typically waiting lists and a high demand for affordable units?
yeah, I believe at least through your housing authority and so forth. Yes, there is.
So completion of just affordable housing units would have a much higher absorption rate if those units were to be built than typical market rate units, or the aggregate of the two.
Could definitely. Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. That being said, overall, so let's say there is a demand for 61 affordable units, each year to be built. In the total market context, is there then demand for 124, add in the market rate ones, housing units to be built and absorbed on a yearly basis in West Hartford? I'd say in 1 or 2, 3-year cycle moving forward, probably. Long term, over a 10-year span, based on the historic data and based on anemic kind of population and job growth, I have to assume that at some point that starts to weaken and fall apart. And I'm not sure that even the affordable demand would be sustained.
In terms, sorry, just 2 more quick ones.
Sure.
In terms of the housing stock issue, though, there's conservatively at least about 1,000 units shy for the lowest income households already in West Hartford that
Yep.
are rent burdened.
Yep.
Okay. And this analysis doesn't take into account households that might move to West Hartford if there are more affordable housing options available. This is just an analysis of the existing population of West Hartford. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. So, for example, Hartford has much different economic demographics in terms of household income across all sorts of family sizes. Is that
Yep.
fair? Okay.
Correct.
All right. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Greg. I see Kevin Sullivan. I see your hand up. Just a reminder, unmute yourself.
First, let me apologize for just joining the meeting when it was rescheduled. I have a standing condo association meeting on the same time, which we just finished. So I do apologize, but I was impressed by your work in the last presentation, and equally impressed by how helpful I think this has been in urging us to find what the balance is going to be between our aspiration and our possibilities. And so in that sense, I think it was both a inspiration to continue to think about how much needs to be done, but a helpful statement on where we might focus our efforts in the hopes of making some reasonable and relatively more rapid progress. Having said that, so I guess just a healthy dose of realism is good for folks who want to do the right thing in terms of figuring out how to do as much of the right thing as we can do. You already focused on two of the key pieces I wanted to ask you say a little bit more about, but I'll go back to pages 16 and the tables on 16 and 17. And I want to make sure that, and I could be reading these quite incorrectly, so I want to make sure I am sort of reading them correctly. It looks like in terms of income range targets for where our ability, absent huge subsidies or absence some kind of super mandate, that we are likely to be able to make progress. It seemed to say that if we think of folks who are in the $50,000 to $75,000 range for owner occupied, and in the $75,000 to $100,000 range for rental, there's a need and there's an opportunity, and that we could find a way to fill some of the gap we have on affordability in those groups. Is that correct or not correct? Correct or not correct reading?
Yeah, I think that's the correct reading. And just to be clear, in my perspective, that is where I think market forces and public policy can work together to make effective change. As you go lower into the income brackets, then public participation and subsidy becomes much more necessary.
And I think that's again, aspiration and progress. We want to do both. We want to be able to, but we want to be able to have something in mind that we think we can accomplish that will be useful to people who need the opportunity. And so I take the second for what you did just talk about on page 19. This may be an unfair question for you, but do you have any perception of what we would need to change in how we do our business in town? By the way, I thought your comments about zoning and development standards being significantly out of sync, maybe not in West Hartford, but overall out of sync with the realities of family size and housing expectation, that we are, in a sense, in our minds, still thinking about a housing that may no longer, that was the standard, but is no longer necessarily the standard, or even the one that we should be thinking about. It's too big, there's too many bedrooms, there's too much space, there's too big a yard. It just isn't a necessary constraint if we're willing to change. So do you have a sense of what it is, if we wanted to do those 90 to 125 qualified units in that period of time, what it is that West Hartford really needs to step up and do? Or is that may not be part of your analysis? You may be giving us the picture of where the opportunity lies, but not the means to do it. So I don't know if that's a fair question.
No, I think it's a fair and good question, and a question I'm willing to give my perspective on. That doesn't mean, I'm telling you what to do, but my perspective is this. One is, I think the shift in the housing market overall on the state level, going from, less than 25% multifamily being built over the past, 30 years or so, to now seeing around 47% of new construction being in the multifamily market, says to me that your West Hartford's greatest opportunities moving forward are in the multifamily market. Because you don't have a bunch of raw land for single family houses. And if you take something like, say, even the UConn West Hartford campus, the cost of acquisition on a site like that's not going to justify single family residential homes. So you're in the multifamily realm. And I'm not saying that site has to be or should be multifamily. I'm just saying realistically, you're in the multifamily realm. When you look at the most recent years of housing production, and if you go to the chart here on the state housing permits, just look at what you've been doing, in recent years. 21 In fact, the majority of what's being built in West Hartford is already multifamily to begin with. That is kind of your marketplace. So I think the multifamily market is the future. I think with multifamily, there's greater opportunity and greater capacity for higher percentiles of affordable to be included. And I think when we look at, 46% of your renter stock being single person, that's probably a fair portion of your affordability challenge. That one person, one income, trying to afford a marketplace that was built for two-income household of the past. So I think kind of, that then starts pointing to one-bedroom units, studios, and even two-bedroom units as kind of being the predominant sweet spot for the housing market.
Or I said the possibility of having a different vision if you're putting up you're putting up 100 units. Those 100 units don't all have to be the same thing.
Right.
Right? You could have a couple threes, a bunch of twos, and mostly ones, but they're
Yeah.
all in the same building.
Yep.
Okay.
It could be, yes.
And likewise, as we've discussed before, that if you're finding a way to put commercial on the first level so that you've got some subsidy for the other two or the other three, that again gives you the opportunity to offset some of the developer costs because there's, well, not the the tenant costs in any event, because there's a revenue stream that goes with the building.
Yeah, so I'm going to say yes, and I agree with you there. I just want to footnote that if this was not West Hartford we were talking about, usually in the greater Hartford market, it's the residential units subsidizing the commercial.
Interesting.
Because the commercial rents are typically weak. West Hartford's somewhat unique. You guys have strong commercial rents, especially in the center, but I believe also up in like Bishop's Corner and so forth. So I think that is the case, that there could be some opportunity to have commercial spaces help subsidize the residential space. But I think that's unique to West Hartford.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Again, thank you for your work.
Thanks.
Greg, I see your hand up again.
Thanks. Yeah, just a question on another topic. So the 8-30G numbers that we have, where we're at 7 or 8% at this point, a large proportion of that is voucher based. Am I reading that right?
Yes.
So do we need to be concerned that the current trend in rental prices is going to price a lot of voucher holders out and is going to potentially drive that number down?
Yeah, so, and I wouldn't say, I didn't include those in this slide, did I, there, in the other slideshow? This is my general feeling, is whether it's vouchers or whether it's CHFA mortgages, all those categories other than the deed restricted category are all transient. They can fluctuate from year to year. So CHFA first time homebuyer mortgage qualifies, but that couple or that person sells that house and moves on, that unit goes away from the qualified affordable. The same with the vouchers. So I think you always have to be cautious and worried about those. And the point you raised, rising rates and are they going to get priced out and so forth? Yeah, that should be a concern.
And that's kind of an example of why perhaps 8-30G doesn't count the so-called natural affordable housing because it can be so transient. Is that?
Yeah, and it's also, I don't think anyone's ever been willing to come to an agreement on what naturally occurring affordable housing is. I know some very close and respected colleagues of mine don't believe that it actually exists. I differ from that perspective. And then it's how do you actually track it? With all the other categories of qualified affordable, they're coming through government programs and they're easy to track, but just, that third floor, 2-bedroom rental in a 3-family house that's privately owned, how do you actually maintain a reasonable record from year to year on that. So there's many challenges to it that I think have stood in its way.
And last question with the home purchase, looking at the 80% AMI, I think that projected that someone could buy something in the range of 195 to 225. Is that, am I remembering
Yeah,
that right?
around there.
And I mean, that's become elusive in West Hartford, right? I looked at Zillow before the call, and I don't think there was a single house for sale under 250,
Yep.
maybe even higher.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's another challenging area of this whole discussion that I don't think is discussed enough at the state level. I'm not sure how realistic. I'm not sure. First, I'm not sure how big of a affordability issue actually exists on the homeownership side. So in those numbers that I provided you with 24% overall with mortgages and without mortgages, those people already have homes. So they're not unable to access the marketplace, but they may be burdened. And I'm not sure all of them are financially burdened. A portion of them are by choice or whatever. So that's number one. Number two is then the affordability and home ownership overall, or at least access into it. I think it's a much more challenging portion of the equation to try and solve, in the sense that housing has become expensive overall, not just in West Hartford, not just in Connecticut, everywhere. So that's one thing. Number two is, to try and solve it with new construction, especially on the home ownership side, construction costs just are far outpacing what affordable, purchase values would be. So I think it's really hard to deal on that side of the equation. And I think the greater need is very much on the renter side. So I think from a policy standpoint, focusing more towards renters makes more sense, at least for a bang for your buck.
And in terms of that cohort already being homeowners, again, that's West Hartford though. If you go wider than West Hartford's borders, there would be more people in that income band who are not homeowners and can't get access to homeownership. Is that fair?
Correct.
All right. And then, all right, promise last question. You're talking about focusing on building rental property. Is it fair to say that direct development of affordable housing is less expensive on a per unit basis than doing these sort of low-income housing tax credit types of developments, or those that require, jumping through a lot more hoops to get financing? So just for example, $1 million appropriated to build affordable housing will build more units than someone seeking $1 million in low-income housing tax credits.
So if you could do it yourself locally, if you had a pool of say $1 million, I would say yes, you could probably do it cheaper than a low-income tax credit deal or most, federal or state funded programs. That being said, and this is where this is where this stuff is challenging. That being said, let's just say, because I think it was you, maybe it wasn't you, but someone at the last meeting said, well, what if we just built the 607,000 units? If we just went ahead and kind of did it, and maybe it wasn't you, but 600,000 units, and let's just say they're 1 and 2 bedroom rentals. We can probably assume $180,000 per unit as a total construction cost. That's including land and so forth, all in. You're talking $100 million plus to actually pull that off. Huge actual cost involved in that, and a very long time frame of returning those values through rents and so forth. So it's challenging. So then I guess I would just pose, if you have $1 million, how do you subsidize the market to get more built? So in one way, just to say, one tool that's used is tax abatements. If you reduce the tax burden on the units, then it's easier to pull off a more affordable rent. If you know, in some cases, government maybe puts in the land, so you remove the land costs and so forth. So you have a bunch of tools you can start doing, or you could start, you know, if you have $1 million, you could say, we're gonna, you know, provide $20,000 per unit to require a guaranteed, you know, affordability at 80%. There's many tools you can start doing to subsidize the marketplace to try and produce those, and maybe try and build them outright yourself.
Would purchasing existing stock and preserving it as affordable also be an option?
You just made my day. I think this is one of the most interesting segments of the potential, one of the most interesting ways to potentially address some of the affordability issues that isn't getting a lot of attention. It doesn't have a lot of discussion around. And I'd say West Hartford is a good candidate in this category. I would also say some of your surrounding communities like Farmington and so forth could be good candidates. And the first time I explored this was in the context of Farmington. So I'm just going to talk to Farmington, so I'm not picking on you guys. Farmington has a lot of kind of 1960s, 1970s, and even 1980s multifamily development. It's actually a fair portion. They haven't built much since then, but most of their stock comes from that era. It's older, it's showing its age, it's in need of care and investment, and it's probably, you know, doing a little better than marginal on its returns to the owner. And those large capital investments are very challenging to pull off: the roofs, the heating systems, and so forth. My general feeling is that a program could be structured where government, whether it be local or state, structured deals to invest in older existing multifamily stock, and essentially saying, like, you know, we will provide you with, you know, I don't know what the deal is, but let's just say we will purchase, or we will, let me rephrase this. We will purchase the affordability rights to 30% of the units at, say, $40,000 per unit. And you have to guarantee that, using the deed restrictions and so forth, you have to guarantee that these units remain affordable in accordance with 8-30G for a period of 40 years. And you have to invest, you know, X percent, large percent of that $40,000 in capital that we just gave you back into the development. I think there is a way to structure a deal to actually make that work. And just one other quick example: in London, England, local councils own a lot of housing. They don't physically own it, but they own leases on it for 100 years. And they rent it at reduced rates to the going rate. And that's within, you know, a building with 20 units. The local council will own 5 of those units and rent them at affordable rates. So similar models have been done elsewhere, and I think it's possible to come up with a model that could work here.
Donna, as a follow-up to Greg's question and the discussion there, a few years ago, I think back in 2018, the city of Minneapolis embarked on a pilot program to do just that. I forget the exact details, and I don't know if you have studied or looked at that, particularly since it was a pilot, but it was essentially a city program to, if I recall correctly, retain and restrict naturally occurring affordable housing within the city through a tax abatement program, as long as the property owners were making a reinvestment in the property and providing a deed restriction for, I think, 60% AMI at the time. And I'm curious if you've kind of tracked that or have seen any of the results of that pilot program.
I haven't, but now I will go looking. So, so thank you. I'll definitely look into that.
Joe, I see your hand up.
Yes, so in terms of providing more rentable income, is there a way to incentivize and change zoning so that homeowners can build accessory apartments or, you know, subdivide their houses or build something else on the property as a way of, you know, and if you subsidize it as affordable, would that be a way to generate more affordable rental housing?
Well, I think the recent changes in state statute for the accessory dwelling unit, and Todd, did you guys opt out or stay in?
So we actually beat the state requirement. We created our own requirement in advance of the state requirement that actually, if you read the state requirement, it looks like they largely based some of their language off of West Hartford zoning. So
Okay.
any property in West Hartford that's single family zone is as of right eligible to create an accessory dwelling unit. So that
Okay.
exists in today, and someone currently could choose to deed restrict those to be qualified for affordable housing under the 830G statute. There's a separate caveat in there for an affordable housing unit that's an ADU. But we allow them anywhere since the program, since the council passed the ordinance about 2 years ago. We've produced about 7, or there's 7 under construction. And I can tell you anecdotally that they're quite expensive to create. So
Yeah.
they're a high cost per square foot, and particularly in a place like West Hartford, to create a new standalone ADU in particular.
Yeah. So one is, I guess, to go back to Joe's question, provide, an answer. One is, I think anytime you can diversify your housing stock, you're gonna provide benefits on the affordability side. So allowing ADUs is great. I think also, and probably more challenging, especially with the stronger value, with the high values of properties in West Hartford. But maybe in some older areas with larger housing stock, it might be worth exploring, the option or how you could allow a large single family to be converted into 2 or more units. I think that's worthy of consideration. Pulling it off, regulatory, I'm sure can be done. Off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of the best. The easy pathway is not coming to me, and kind of the challenges of creating too substantial of change in the neighborhood may also be challenging. But I think that that's worthy of looking at as an option. So I hope that helps. If you think about it, I'm just gonna editorialize. If you think about it, where a lot of your naturally occurring affordable product is within those 2 and 3 family units that you guys have a fair share of in the community, especially compared to other suburbs. So that 2 and 3 family unit housing stock is probably functioning as a reasonably affordable market affordability product. And if you could get more of that into your community, you could probably, better benefit affordability overall. It's just challenging with existing development and existing neighborhood patterns.
So there might be a benefit to someone buying a larger home and then creating a rental apartment within it to subsidize owning the home and also to provide an affordable unit to somebody.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's a way to even incentivize that, let people know they could do that. Or
Yeah.
financially incentivize it.
One is, as Todd has said, it's expensive. It's not cheap to build accessory units. It's having to come into compliance with all the codes and doing so. But things like providing tax abatement, or at the very least a freeze in the taxes. My mind's blurring right now. I just recommended in the community, I can't remember where, but kind of a tax freeze. Oh, I think it was in Wyndham, that for new investments in housing units, the addition of units into structures, that the taxes would be frozen for a 5 to 10 year period. So they wouldn't have to pay new taxes on that accessory dwelling unit that was added and so forth. So there's different incentives that could be provided to help absorb the costs. So.
Thanks, Joe. Kevin, your hand's up again.
Just to follow up on the conversation you just had, and I know I don't know about, I'm going to ask you about the economics of it as opposed to the politics of it, because I understand, I've had enough experience with the politics of it to understand how difficult it can be. For example, there is the West Hartford side of Prospect has a number of very large, older homes, some of which were illegally affordable housing for many years because they were rooming houses, but they were never recognized as rooming houses. What are the economics of that's different than building a new building? It's taking an existing building and turning a single family into a duplex. What are the economics of that, where you have those opportunities?
It's still challenging.
Okay.
You know, at the end of the day, rehab construction costs can often run nearly as high as new construction costs, and in some cases can exceed it. So it's challenging, and I guess the best way to describe it is the economics are going to be different on a property by property basis. Depends on probably the existing configuration and so forth. Just a little anecdote on the side. I knew someone years ago who rented an accessory dwelling unit on an older large house in Woodbridge, what is it? Walbridge. The road that goes down to Elizabeth Park, a few blocks in from
Walbridge.
Yeah, Walbridge. And you know, it's kind of funny. I remember being in that unit, and it was great. It was probably the old maid's quarter, and by today's standards, probably didn't meet the code requirements for what is a unit, but it very much functioned as an affordable accessory unit. And the key obstacle was access was through the primary kitchen of the house. It didn't have its own individual access. But there's probably many others out there, and providing, you know, tax incentives or other incentives to get those converted or get them up to code and so forth, and more, you know, within the primary market could be beneficial.
So I could add, Don, you know, a couple of years ago, Kevin, when we did some research for the council and looked at the accessory dwelling unit issue, we looked at, there was a ULI study that looked at the 3 cities that had some at least relevant and good numbers to draw from. There were Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, granted not directly applicable for West Hartford, but they had experience producing several hundred units of accessory dwelling units at the time. This goes back to 2016, 17, and I'll share the study with the group. I think the average cost within those cities for a new construction of an ADU, I'll have to go back and look, and I think it did not differentiate, or at least the average included both an internal conversion of existing building space or through detached. It was somewhere around 156,000, and that's going 7 or 8 years ago. And then if you looked at the cost per square foot, it was even higher than you'd expect, because some of those communities are certainly more progressive, and they were allowing much smaller sized accessory dwelling units down to, you know, what we would consider micro units in the 250 to 300 square foot range. So I recall some of those costs per square foot, like $200 a square foot at the time of that study, and, you know, cost has significantly gone up since that time. But I'll send that out because I think it's relevant to this conversation. If this is something we want to consider exploring more of, is incentivizing the production of ADUs within the community. Are there any other questions for Don? Seeing none, I just want to make sure I can see anyone else's hand up or on screen. Don, thank you very much for your presentation again, and thank you for all the good work you've provided for our group.
Thank you, Todd. I appreciate it. You and I should touch base pretty soon and figure out where we go from here. So sure.
So for the rest of the group, our next meeting in August, we would like to convene a group of the whole to look at a summary of this meeting, all of the data. Brian is interested, he's still on the line, but interested in polling the data collection subcommittee just to see if there's any other data that you are interested in trying to bring into this process. If not, we thought the next meeting might make sense to start talking about plan implementation. So let's look at the data, let's look at the community outreach based on what we have in 2 summary reports, and then start talking about implementation as a subcommittee. First, I think to give that subcommittee its fair time in the process. Any questions or thoughts on that approach? Kevin.
Thanks, Todd. And I'm glad you're touching on this because to move, I'm trying to get a sense, or I'm putting this question out more to get a sense of what the manager's expectation is and what your because we are advisory to him and he is advisory to the council, and what your expectation is in terms of what what would be the nature of our final product. And I'm not saying what would be the detail of our final project. What would be the nature of the final project? Would it be to merely identify, I don't mean merely, that's not fair. Would it be to identify a glide path that says the town should commit to the following over the following period of time with the following types of things involved in providing the housing that we seek? And that's sort of a 30,000 foot recommendation, right? Maybe it's a 90,000 foot recommendation. At the bottom of that is another whole kind of recommendation, and that is that the current zoning with respect to multifamily residential should be changed to do the following things. So I'm trying to get a sense of what his expectation, what the council's expectation was, and what his expectation is of the kind of report you're looking for, given the time frame that we have. For example, if it was to be something more at the 20,000 foot range, it would require us to understand building and zoning. I'd need to know building and zoning all over again in terms of where to make those changes. If it was aspirational with goals and objectives and something we believe is doable, and then it falls to the council and the planning office and the manager to figure out the way. I guess, do you have a sense of you could say it's up to us, but I think it's really up to what the expectation was coming forward as to what kind of recommendations we can reasonably expect to make in the time frame that's available to us.
Sure. I think, Kevin, I think that's a great starting point for the discussion of the implementation subcommittee. But if I was going to suggest one approach, is probably the latter approach. So I would say it's more of a POCD model that has higher level goals and with some strategies and then some detailed actions. And as we discuss that implementation piece, I think we're going to have to revisit and re-educate ourselves about zoning and its role. I really don't think building code has any significant discussion point because at the state level, building code is adopted at the state level, really. And we are looking at those things, and they do affect cost for housing and other things, but we don't really have much control of that at the local level. What we do have control over is zoning, and we touched upon it a couple of times in prior meetings, and then again tonight and in Don's prior presentation. We do control some of the key metrics, at least the council controls some of the key metrics at different paths and opportunities to produce different types of housing. And that's what zoning does at the high level, right? One approach and say it restricts housing altogether, right? It tells us what type of housing can go where and how much and how tall, how tall and how many units on a parcel. So those are the conversations that I'd like this group to have, the subcommittee to have, and try to get a consensus around an approach. And then hopefully for that meeting, we'll have the manager there. He was double booked tonight. And we can start to probe his preference on that report.
That, Todd, that's if I'm still on, I guess that's helpful, because in thinking about this, from my years on the council, we have a framework called, well, we have two frameworks. We have a town plan, and then we have the zoning ordinances of the town. And most of those, let's take housing as our challenge. Most of those sort of say, this area is X. It's single family residential. Or it's multi, but it's this type of multi. What it doesn't tell us is that what flexibility do you have as of right? So there's the as of right. What can you do in that area? But what you can do in that area versus what you might be able to do in that area are different things, usually which come about by way of some variance, or some, not a variance as literally a variance, but a variation, special development or something like that says, okay, even though normally the houses that would have to be put up here, and we'll just do single family for the moment, even though that's not going to be our focus, every house that goes in here would have to look sort of like this. It has to be this big. It has to have this side yard. It has to have this backyard. It has to have this front yard. It has to have this many thises and this many that's. All of which have already told us that there's only one way to get this many units on that piece of property. Similarly with I don't know, I don't recall so much with respect to multifamily. Does it say that when you're doing multifamily, you can do 6 1-bedrooms, 10 1-bedrooms and 22 bedrooms and no 3-bedrooms, and you can mix it all up in the same building? So I don't personally, and I don't necessarily have to if that's not our job, but I think understanding what the constraints are, right? That if we were to just blue sky and say what we wanted to do was focus on these income ranges and focus on this type of housing and focus on this period of time, and what we needed to do is find a way to make more intensive use of available multifamily housing in the town, what are the impediments that would have to make it easier rather than harder? That's number one. And number two is there a model, or are there models where we have a housing authority, but that housing authority has been a quasi-public housing authority, has been a relatively modest enterprise, and has mostly focused on senior housing, as I guess always focused only on, not entirely, but close to senior housing. Is there a case to be made that, particularly if there's going to be public money behind this in some fashion, that you need to step this enterprise away from TP&Z, and you need to step it away from the town council, and we need to think in terms of some authority, public authority, and an affordable housing authority within the town of West Hartford that would be able to be the vehicle for receiving public funds, receiving private funds, and sort of being the guide over all of this. So there's the two kinds of questions. You've answered one. The second one, I think, is still a good question for for us to think about, and that is, are there some models out there that suggest the best way to sustain this conversation over time is not to just rely on the existing governance structure, but maybe to create another force in the community?
Both.
Thank you.
Good thoughts. Yeah, both good thoughts and ideas, Kevin. I think the answer to both is probably yes. So what we're going to do next week is send out some of those plans, and you'll see the other communities. And that model, the one that you kind of just talked about, exists in a couple of communities that have had pretty successful affordable housing production in the state, and have retained that over a period of years. And they've done it another number of different ways, either through a housing development authority or a housing trust fund that's a little bit more flexible that the town funds. So great thoughts and ideas, and hopefully we can continue both in all of those conversations. The one thing, just as a reminder, zoning, it can be a useful tool, but it's not surgical. So you talked about, bedroom counts. We don't regulate bedroom counts under zoning, under our existing zoning. So we say if a property can support 50 units of housing, it could be all studios, it could be all ones. It's not in our zoning, and it's not typically found in zoning. Just like we don't regulate through zoning whether or not a unit has to be owner occupied. So a multifamily property of 50 units could be 50 rental units or 50 owner-occupied condominiums. Again, not something we typically do, but definitely worth having that primer discussion again at that implementation level, because I think that will help inform and guide some of our ideas and recommendations that we might want to consider pursuing. There's nothing else. Thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
Stay cool.
Yes, very important.